Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lissy Medvedow, Executive Director of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy at Boston College Law School, along with my colleagues at the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston at the Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome to today's debate, asking the question, should public school teachers have the right to strike in Massachusetts? This debate is part of our Greater Boston debate series, which we launched a few years ago to bring forward conversations on critical, controversial, and contemporary issues, hoping to engage experts in dialogue, which is informative, educational, and as we say, sometimes messy. We've held debates on criminal justice, education, rent control, public transportation, public records, immigration, and more. If anyone watching today has suggestions for future debate topics, please let us know. We're open to ideas. For today's debate, we're very fortunate to have as our moderator, Carrie Jung, Senior Education Reporter for WBUR. Carrie started her reporting career in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and has also been a senior field correspondent in Phoenix, Arizona. She's reported on education and Native American issues to various additional media outlets, including Public Radio International, Al Jazeera America, and National Native News. She's the recipient of 2 national awards from the Native American Journalists Association and has also won a regional award from the Society of Professional Journalists. Carrie will introduce our panelists, who will help shine a light on the issues and the nuances involved in teacher strikes. What we know going into this debate is that in 12 states across the country, public school teachers have the legal right to strike. Massachusetts is not one of those states. In the past year, Haverhill, Malden, and Woburn have experienced teacher strikes, and the other school districts have had work stoppages. There's so much at stake here. How can we best support teachers who might just be the most important professionals in society? Are strikes effective, necessary, appropriate? Do strikes affect our kids' education? What are viable alternatives? Before we explore these questions, I have 2 quick housekeeping matters. 1, this debate is being recorded. And 2, we are planning to reserve 15 minutes at the end for questions. Please use the Q&A function to pose your questions. We hopefully will get to as many or all as possible. Carrie, the virtual floor is yours.
Great. All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I know I am very excited for this conversation. This is a question, should public school teachers here in Massachusetts have the legal right to strike? It's a question that, my team at WBUR has dived into on several occasions, whether it's been checking in on the individual strikes this year and last in places like Haverhill, Woburn, and Malden, or even just exploring what seems to be an emerging trend where we're seeing more teachers unions having voted to strike, even though doing so is illegal here in Massachusetts and would result in a court injunction or a pretty hefty fine. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our debaters for this topic. Should public school teachers here have the right to strike? Up first is Max Page. He is the current president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association, which is an organization, it's a statewide organization with more than 115,000 members. Prior to holding a leadership role at the MTA, Max worked as a professor of architecture at UMass Amherst, where he also served as the director of the Master of Design and Historic Preservation program. Although also with us to debate this topic is Paul Levy. Paul is a longtime Newton resident and a school committee member with the Newton Public Schools. He represents Ward 6. Before joining the school committee, Paul was the CEO of Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. He was a professor of urban studies at MIT and was the executive director of the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority during the Boston Harbor cleanup. All right, Paul, Max, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Okay, so I'm just going to jump in with questions now. Max, I'm going to start again with you. I want to ask you, why why do you think teachers should have the legal right to strike here in Massachusetts? And when you answer this question, I want you to also sort of address what legal right means to you, especially, because we have seen teachers strike here. So if you can explain that a little bit more and what you would hope to see kind of in a perfect world of it being legal.
Sure. So it's really great to be here, and thank you for moderating this debate, Carrie. And as you mentioned, I have the privilege of leading the Massachusetts Teachers Association, which is about 115,000 educators, teachers, paraprofessionals, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, as well as public college and university faculty. And together, those members have produced the finest public education system in the country. And as a union, as locals, as well as the statewide union, we have advocated and won substantial improvements for our public schools, such as through the Fair Share Amendment, the Millionaire's Tax to provide funding for schools and colleges, funding for the Student Opportunity Act so that the neediest districts get more of what they need. So at the local level and the statewide level, the MTA is committed to providing outstanding public education for everyone in the Commonwealth. Even though we're the best public system in the country, our members demand that it be fairer and better. And sometimes that means forcing school committees and mayors to take bargaining seriously and engage with proposals made by our members to improve our public schools. Contract negotiations are a place where our members put forward positive proposals for how to improve the working and learning conditions in our schools. So we support the right to strike for educators to equalize the conditions between educators and school committees at the bargaining table. Right now, in many places, school committees have no sense of urgency, but also feel no legal pressure to address the concerns raised by educators during bargaining. And we've seen bargaining proposals ignored for months and months, and then the school committees, at the urging of their high-priced lawyers, going for mediation, which is a time-consuming and costly process. And really the only ones who benefit there are the lawyers who are counting up their billable hours. So the bill we support, to answer your first question, it would return that fundamental right to withhold one's labor to public workers so that they can level the playing field and bring bargaining to a successful conclusion. And through that process, improve our schools. And that means eliminating the potential injunction, the fines, potential jail time that have been imposed over the past 50 years at different moments. It would equalize and provide that right. And I think the evidence has been clear, and I'm sure we'll talk about this further on in the debate. Those locals who on their own ultimately decided they needed to go on strike for their students won fairer pay for our paraprofessionals. They won improved working conditions for educators so they could be their best. They addressed long-standing issues of class size, paid family leave, the need for counselors and mental health professionals. And they also even went beyond that and used the contract negotiations to push for changes such as addressing affordable housing in communities to support the families of our students. So let me just be crystal clear. Educators never want to go on strike. I have not met a single educator who said, I wish to go on strike. And that's really important because these educators, our members of our union, are so committed to their work. It's almost galling to them to have to do this, but they do it as a last resort. And when they do it, it's because they're fighting not just for themselves, but to improve their schools in ways that benefits the students, the parents, and the community.
Great, thank you, Max. Paul, I want to turn to you. Why do you believe that teachers should not have the right to strike here in Massachusetts? And I also am curious to have you respond to Max's sentiment that he just mentioned that school committees seem to not have a sense of urgency in bargaining. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carrie. Max, it's a pleasure and privilege to be with you today. We hadn't met before today, and I'm really pleased we have the chance because I know you've been a highly effective leader at the MTA and elsewhere, and I congratulate you for that. I just want to start, Carrie, by saying that although I'm on the Newton School Committee, I am not here speaking for the Newton School Committee. I can't do that as an individual member, even if I wanted to. There are some times I'd like to, but I'm not allowed to. So this is my personal opinion. based on my knowledge of negotiation in general, in the schools in particular, and more broadly, having served as a public servant in many places where the very same law is in effect that prohibits public employee strikes. For example, when I was at the Mass Water Resources Authority and when I was at the State Department of Public Utilities. My view of this is different from Max's. Obviously, that's why we're both here. And what I think I would question some of his assertions. The first one of which is that he implies that there isn't a level playing field between school committees or municipal officials and the unions when negotiations are taking place. I believe there is, that there are plenty of avenues open to the unions during the course of negotiation, which they readily employ, that are effective, that are state sanctioned, that can have the effect of putting pressure on school committees to agree to provisions that at first they might not find to be appropriate and in the interest of the students, and that there is a level playing field. Secondly, if the law were to be changed to permit strikes, I believe there could be real harm caused to students and families in the districts in which in which the strike would take place. And we'll get into that in the future, but that is a countervailing public policy concern that I think has to be recognized. And that in fact was at the origin of the strike prohibition many, many decades ago. And finally, I don't know why Max feels that school committees don't feel a sense of obligation and even urgency to get contracts signed in timely fashion, because it's in everybody's interests, the students, the municipality, the school committee, the school system, as well as the unions to have contracts settled. We all go into this in good faith. I think we all go into this hoping for the very best for our students and indeed for the teachers and the other staff in the schools. But it's the nature of negotiation that there are differences of opinion. And it's the negotiation process, fairly constituted, that allows us to resolve those differences of opinion.
Thank you, Paul. I do want to follow up with an additional question for you when it comes to, I think one thing that maybe a lot of people watching this might be thinking, if they've been watching the news, that, a union might be negotiating with a school committee for a while, and then once they vote to go on strike, it seems like pretty quickly there is a resolution there. If you could just reflect on that, that we've seen in some of the illegal strikes that have gone on here in Massachusetts. As a school committee member, I guess, how do you read that pattern?
The way I read that pattern, having viewed what happened in Haverhill and other communities in Brookline, is that that those communities and the unions were very, very close to agreements in the first place, and that the unions decided to call a strike illegally and were subject to fines and the like, and then there was a quick settlement, usually very close to or along the lines of where the parties were in any event. And I think we have to consider the possibility that it's in some political sense to the union leaders' political advantage within their own unions to give the impression that the agreement was forced so that they can more comfortably explain to their own members why they agreed to the provisions in the first place. So I don't think the strikes change the ultimate result, But I think they can sometimes be a convenience for the union leaders.
Right, thank you, Paul. Max, I want to give you a chance to respond to that before I move to the next question.
Sure. There's another number of fallacies there. There were vast improvements that came about in part because those locals were building up towards and were willing to go on strike. Sometimes the dramatic improvements happened, for instance, in Melrose through a strike vote, and then the negotiation within 24 hours. A very improved contract was won. So in fact, the strike is the most dramatic and most powerful tool that labor has, and that has been denied for public sector workers, which has been allowed some school committees and mayors to intentionally stonewall. And they have a playbook for delaying and mediation and stonewalling, sometimes for years, like in Brookline. That's what some of our members in different locals have said, you know what, enough is enough. We're going to force an end to this. There is no level playing field in that there is no consequence to school committees when they fail to bargain in good faith. And I think that's important for listeners to understand. If a school committee just does nothing, twiddles their thumbs, we can file what's called an unfair labor practice. And many, many months later, the Department of Labor may say, bad school committee, go back to bargaining in good faith. There is really no punishment. There's no fines. There's no nothing. And school committees have been, and superintendents and mayors have realized this, and with their sometimes $600 or $700 an hour lawyers, have decided to exploit that and try to outweight the educators. And I just want to say one final thing, which is that we have 400 locals in the MTA. We represent educators in virtually every single school district in the state. And there have been 5 strikes or strike votes in the past year and a half or so. In other words, in most places, we have good partnerships and there may be tough negotiations, but ultimately they come to an agreement. It is necessary, though, sometimes to have this right to move a recalcitrant or stonewalling school committee or mayor in order to achieve the gains, improvements to schools that educators have laid out. And I just want to name one, which has been at the center of many of our contract negotiations and including the strikes, which is for decades, we have paid education support professionals, our paraprofessionals, poverty wages. People we praise and praise and praise, and school committees laud over and over, but they pay them poverty wages. And so we have a movement to say those educators, and they are educators, deserve a living wage. And it has been in Haverhill and Malden and Woburn and in other places, dramatic improvements to the pay for those what we call essential support professionals, essential educators who all love and care for and believe in, but we now need to pay them living wages. And it has been through these contract actions and these strikes that many have received 20 or 30 or 40% wage increases that gets them closer to a living wage. We still haven't done that. And I guess I would say to Paul, and I know he's not speaking for the school committee, but why can't Newton, one of the wealthiest cities in the Commonwealth, which is one of the wealthiest states in the nation, not simply respond to that demand and pay living wages for these essential educators?
Well, Carrie, as you know,
Well, I was going to say, I'll give you a chance to quickly respond to that since there was quite a bit in that.
quite a bit. First of all, I cannot respond about the current negotiation going on between the Newton School Committee and the Newton Teachers Association. That would just be inappropriate. The numbers, the wages that are paid to paraprofessionals in Newton are there for all to see, and I think if you did, you would see they're among the highest in the state. But I think the more important thing is that what Max characterizes as stonewalling or recalcitrance or negotiating in poor faith, I think we have to recognize that they're just differences of opinion, and what might appear to one to be a negotiation in bad faith is not that. Is the fact that there are different requirements of the two organizations, and the negotiation can can go on for some time. There's back and forth that occurs, and that's not a sign of bad faith. In addition, a movement to mediation in the event that the parties cannot agree, if they reach an impasse, notwithstanding their best intentions. By the way, no one here is trying to harm children in the schools. We all have a common goal of providing the best possible environment for the children. And we actually have a common goal in providing the best possible environment for the teachers and the other staff. There's no one in the state who feels differently from that, as far as I've ever met. But in the event there is an impasse, the state law provides for mediation. And mediation is not an abusive tool. It's a voluntary agreement to meet with a non-binding mediator. And having personally done mediation myself over the years, often a mediator, a really competent mediator, can help the parties find areas to trade on or otherwise reach agreement. That's one of the tools currently available to the union, to request the state to appoint a mediator or to appoint a fact finder. That's among the tools the unions have. But the unions have other tools here in terms of publicizing their demands, everything from wearing shirts and the like in the schools, making their case, signs, supporting political candidates for public office. There's a full panoply of things. Work to rule. They can decide to work strictly to the contract provisions. And that's a very effective, or can be a very effective tool to put pressure on the school committee to accede to some of the requests that are made during negotiation. No school committee wants to have kids not getting college recommendation letters because that's not a requirement of a contract. So there are plenty of opportunities for the union to engage in political and public action in a very public way that can help their cause.
Great, Paul, you took my next question, so I will way to read my mind there, but so I'll move on to the next one. Max, I'm gonna address this one to you next. I know this is an argument that I hear quite a bit when talking about whether teachers should have the right to strike. It's that doing so keeps kids out of school, which means they're not learning, and it's disruptive to their families is the argument. And it's just a whole host of things that not having that school day could cause. And so I want you to respond to that criticism that's out there.
Sure. Let me just very briefly just note that when I talked about the bill, the legislation that we have supported, it allows for 6 months of good faith negotiations, and that's just more than enough time to come to an agreement. These are successor agreements, meaning there's a original contract, and then each 3 years there's an update to it, and that 6 months is more than enough time. So that is built into the bill, that zone to actually work it out. And if after 6 months, then the union has the right to go on strike. All right, so there's this question about hurting kids. So let me just start with one important point, which I'll give in terms of numbers, and then I'll give a little more in terms of a story. 2 to 1. The community, the public supports the right to strike for educators. There's been 2 polls out. You'll soon see a third one that shows this. And this shouldn't be surprising, because I think, as someone said at the very beginning of the show, our members are some of the most respected people in every community in the Commonwealth, and certainly, it's been shown over and over again, the most respected voices on public education. One parent in Quincy during a contract rally there said, "I'm a parent. If the educators say they need X, Y, or Z in their contract, I support it because they care for my child, they nurture my children, they educate them, they know best what is needed for their working conditions and their learning conditions." So what we have seen, even in the most contentious strikes and the longest ones in many years, is that there was a 5 days in Woburn, and no educator is happy with not being in the school. And I was there on the ground helping out with negotiations, and heard the pain of educators wanting to be back with their students, worrying about them, but they also knew that it had come to a point where they had to take a stand. And there, one of the top issues also was pay for the para professionals. The fact that parents with their students came out to the picket lines, came to school committees, the football team in Haverhill marched down to the school committee meeting. I heard some of the most eloquent speeches by high school students on City Hall steps, speaking in behalf of those educators, showed that the community, from the students, the parents, the wider community, understood that the short-term pain of schools being closed and the short-term dislocation was worth it for the long-term improvement of the schools. So the community understands that. And you might have thought in the wake of the strikes that happened this past winter and fall, that this polling would have suggested that people would say, this is terrible, this is hurting kids. I think they realize that ultimately it is helping their young people because it is improving the public schools in their communities.
Great, thank you, Max. Paul, I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
Well, I think the important thing here, Carrie, is what's behind the public policy that strikes are not allowed for public employee unions, whether it's teachers or whether it's workers at the water and sewer system or transit workers or whatever. And a lot of people say that there's a strike prohibition because these are essential public services, and they are essential public services. But the real reason I believe that the prohibition exists is that not only are they essential public services, but they're monopolies. So this is different from having a strike in a retail establishment or even a nurse's strike in a hospital, in that the public has no choice for the most part. I mean, there are some families in private school, obviously, but the vast majority of students are in the public schools. And when there is a strike, the families have no option but to suffer the consequences of that strike. And because you have no option, your child and your family and the community are hurt by the strike. This goes beyond the loss of classroom learning. For example, if you're income eligible and your child is on a free lunch program, there will be no free lunch in school that day. If your child is a special needs child requiring one-to-one special education aids, and there's no school that day, you as a parent have to find a way to take care of that child. If you need to go to work to make ends meet and your child can't go to school and you don't have coverage, you lose your pay that day. If a parent is a teacher in another district and can't go to work, their school has to spend money on a substitute. If they can't find one, the children in that school will miss a portion of their education. So contrary to what we often hear from people that in the unions, that the benefits of strikes accrue to many more than just the public sector workers, it's actually not the case. Other people are harmed. And that's the public policy imperative here. I don't know about all the polls to which Max refers, but I do know of one that Commonwealth Magazine published, in which the first question they asked of people in their poll was whether they thought it was currently legal or illegal for public school teachers in Massachusetts to strike. And what they found was that the public generally was poorly informed about this. And so perhaps this debate will help that. A third of those polled incorrectly thought striking was currently legal. And 22% they didn't know or didn't answer. So I think it's not appropriate to rely on those polls, some of which are commissioned by the unions in the first place. I look at the fact that our three senior leaders in Massachusetts politics, the governor, the Speaker of the House, and the President of the Senate, none of whom are anti-labor in any way, and in fact have received labor support over the years, have all said they don't favor a change in the law.
Great, thanks, Paul. Max, I see you were hoping to respond to that, so I want to give you just a quick minute or two to respond.
Sure, thanks. So, I mean, the monopoly argument is a standard right-wing talking point. There are 12 states that have right to, where public sector workers have the right to strike. Actually, we saw something recently in Los Angeles where, again, the paraprofessionals were on strike for 3 days and won a substantial increase to pay that had been depressed for so many years. One of the issues is that educators, though they are unionists, they are believers in the rules and they are rule followers. So it takes a lot for educators to stand up and assert their dignity. And we saw that in a state where, in California, where you could go on strike, that the paraprofessionals did that. A few other points. Our members always made sure that students were fed during those strikes. The days that are lost, and I should say the days are often lost because of a strategy by the lawyers such in Haverhill or Woburn to intentionally boost up fines. So they shut down bargaining earlier in the day, refused to bargain late into the evening, simply in order to try to bankrupt the local union. So let's ask where the real blame lies in the schools being closed. But those days are made up at the end of the year. There's a requirement about school days, and those days are all made up so students do not lose those days. And there's one thing about special needs. Some of the arguments, the most powerful arguments that have underscored some of the strikes that have happened is the need not only to have fair pay for our education support professionals and our paraprofessionals, many of them whom work with our students with special needs, but the need for more of them to provide the full care that those students need. There's been a long complaint that those students are not getting the services they need because there are not sufficient numbers of paraprofessionals, in part because you cannot attract them when they can make more pay at Dunkin' Donuts. So our members are very aware of the immediate costs for their students, the families of strikes, and they only have done it as a last resort when it seemed absolutely necessary in order to achieve the improvements that they had demanded for many years.
Great, thank you, Max.
Well, Carrie, I have to say, I can't
Go ahead,
let go of this assertion that an argument based on the monopoly position of public employee unions is somehow a right-wing point of view. I don't know if Max is accusing me personally of being a right-winger, as a person who has signed what at the time was the largest project labor agreement in Massachusetts, and otherwise have worked in very positive ways with unions. But this isn't a right-wing or left-wing issue. This is an issue truly of what the effect is on families and children when a strike occurs. And all I'm saying is there's a bona fide public policy reason for that prohibition. I fully respect the fact that Max and I differ on this, but I don't view this in any way as a partisan or a political spectrum kind of issue. It's just a difference of opinion of what's the most effective way to achieve good labor agreements.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to move to the next question. And these are always sort of my favorite questions when it comes to debates. So Paul,
You're going to ask me about my children?
No, so Paul, I'll start with you on this question. What room do you see here for compromise? Or maybe a better way to ask that is, what would it take to move you to the other side on this issue?
On this issue, I don't see a possible compromise. This is binary. It's either allowed or not allowed. And there's a long history of a prohibition against public employee strikes. Again, this is not just teachers we're talking about. This is public employees of all kinds. And I just don't see that we have a problem that needs to be solved. I see where Max and I disagree, I think, is I see a process that generally works quite well. I see well-intentioned people on both sides, both in the unions and the school committees or the mayor's office, trying their best to reach an agreement that's in the interest of the children and indeed of the staff. of the teachers and the other staff. It's the nature of negotiation that there are differences of opinion. There are different constraints. And what we all go into with the best of intentions and good faith is trying to resolve that. There's no advantage to stalling that I can see here. And quite the contrary, from the municipal point of view, from the school committee point of view, in terms of morale of staff and reducing uncertainty, and indeed in terms of recruiting and retaining the best possible people to work in the schools, of course you want to have an agreement that's settled expeditiously and fairly. So I don't see that there's a problem that needs to be solved, Carrie. So I don't see a need to change the status quo.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Max, I want to turn to you. Is there room for compromise here, in your opinion?
There can't be, because the right to withhold one's labor is a very central fundamental value of labor. What labor does is sell its time. Our members get paid to do certain hours and tasks, and ultimately the most powerful action, if needed to be used, is to withhold that labor. So there's no sort of wiggle room there. And I just need to reassert that these happen rarely, and frankly, they may happen even less often if we had the right to strike, because the clock would be ticking on employers, on those few employers who refuse to bargain in good faith. But educators coming out of the pandemic, where they kind of weathered the storm and are seeing the difficulties and the challenges among their students with their mental health issues, educators' mental health issues, and then the lack of support, they are saying enough is enough. So long-standing issues that they have asked nicely for many, many years, such as living wages for paraprofessionals, or social workers and mental health professionals to address the epidemic of mental health issues among our students, they've found deaf ears among some school committees, and they've been willing to say enough is enough and take this action in order to get the school committees and mayors to respond, and also to bring contentious negotiations to a conclusion. I would argue that what Brookline Educators Union, which went on strike a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, that was 3 years in the making, and they brought a contentious community to difficulty to a conclusion, to the betterment of the schools. So this is a fundamental right, and frankly, the advancement of our schools has been hindered in some places by the inability to access this important right. And I just want to highlight that we talk about level playing field. Let's be clear that in the United States, the labor law very much is tilted against employees and for employers. And that's all private and public sector. And in the public sector here in Massachusetts, we have the added hindrance of not having that ultimate lever, which is the right to strike without massive fines or imprisonment.
Carrie, and if I may, although Max and we're disagreeing on some important points, but I want to make clear that we actually agree on some major points that he's made, which get to the role and the dedication of the teachers and the other staff. We've just been through an awful time in terms of the pandemic, and from the teacher's point of view, not only was that an awful time, but now it's an exceptionally difficult time, because those students really their social and emotional development was really set back as a result of remote education and all the other things that were going on during the pandemic, and so it's really a hard time for many teachers to have to deal with those social and emotional issues, and also the fact that academic progress often fell back as well. So I fully agree with him that they deserve our credit They deserve our support, and they deserve our blessings, truthfully, for what they've done and the work they've done. I've met school committee members from around the state. I have yet to find anyone who disagrees with that, with what he and I just said on that front. And I've yet to find any who've come into negotiations saying, well, let's hold this thing up as much as we can, and let's, just hold back so that we don't get a contract. As elected school committee members, we have to answer to the public every 2 years. And the public can be informed and is informed on these issues by the very union with which we're negotiating. They can engage in all kinds of public education and pressure, and they can engage in campaigns themselves. They vote on, the union votes on which candidates to support in school committee races. They're allowed to give money towards those candidates, either directly or as part of super PACs. And most importantly, they've got feet on the ground. They can have people out there delivering leaflets and getting the vote out and so on. So when Max talks about an inequality between the potential influence and power that a union has versus the public body negotiating with the union under the state law, I just don't see it that way. And frankly, I don't feel it that way as a school committee member.
Just to be clear, like on one issue, since the pandemic, we do agree with how much dislocation and struggle educators and students have faced. That's why, and contracts are value statements, and contract negotiations represent value statements. And in Newton, but elsewhere, our members have said, you know what, we see it. We experience the mental health, the behavioral issues our students are facing. That's why we need to finally achieve the ratio of counselors to students that is recommended by national bodies. And in this state, we're way off that. So in Newton, they're putting that proposal, and they've been putting that proposal on the table to have a social work in every school committee shuts it down. So our members, what they do is they come to the bargaining table with priorities to improve the public schools, their learning and working conditions. And in many cases, they're able to resolve those through sort of regular negotiations. And in some places, they've had to go further and withhold labor until the school committee responded to those demands.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that, Max. And we've hit the time in the program where it is time for listener questions. So I am going to pull up the chat where a few of those have been flowing in. Let's see. Okay. One person asks, does Mr. Levy believe that public sector strikes should also be prohibited? So I guess outside of just teacher strikes. What about the 1968 Memphis sanitation workers strike? Well,
each of these, first of all, the rules are set by each state and subject to the usual approach of state legislators and governors deciding what they think is best for that state. In Massachusetts, there's a general prohibition of strikes by public employees. When I was running the water authority, the water and sewer workers, for example, represented by their unions, were not permitted to strike. Why is that? Well, because they're the sole provider of water and sewer service to 2.5 million people. And if that's disrupted, you have all kinds of terrible results. And likewise for other public service employees. So I don't see a distinction among the various kinds of public service workers on the general policy imperative. That is, in essence, it's an essential service, it's a monopoly service. The public is harmed when there's a strike. In the case of the teachers, the particular public that's harmed are the children and the families.
All right, another question has come in, and this person wants both of you to address this. Max, you've touched on this a little bit already, but the viewer writes, what do each of you account for the overwhelming support of the union actions from parents and communities in the districts where strikes have taken place? So because we've heard a little bit from Max on this already, Paul, I want you to respond to that first.
Well, I don't know that there is overwhelming community support when there's a strike. There's certainly sympathy for teachers. I mean, people love their teachers and they want them to be treated well. And often during the course of negotiations, because the school committees are reluctant to divulge the particular gives and takes and the like that are going on within the negotiations, but the union is choosing to characterize the negotiations as being inappropriate with regard to the teacher's needs, there's a tendency for the public to think, well, maybe that's true. But they don't know the whole story. The details aren't out there. But I've also talked to parents who believe that the teachers are generally getting a fair shake in the negotiations, and that the idea that even work to rule, which is permitted under the law, is a practice that actually harms the union standing in the eyes of parents. So I don't know that the premise of the question is actually correct.
So if I'll just jump in.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Okay,
Max, I want to give you
premise,
the second to respond.
yeah, I mean, it's, maybe it's not surprising that a former CEO hasn't been on the ground like I have been, supporting these locals in Haverhill and Malden and Woburn and in other places where there are very strong contract campaigns that have happened. They're actually the most beautiful moments that I have witnessed and participated in as president of the MTA in my first year, because you saw not only educators standing up for themselves, and sometimes we are talking about 70-year-old women who are paraprofessionals making $28,000 a year and saying, I can never retire, and willing to go on strike in order to improve the working conditions and learning conditions. But it's then the whole community support, the hundreds of people who showed up at school committee meetings in Malden and Haverhill, the speeches by the young people. Was one story I just want to share, which is that one educator who had never gone on strike, most educators had never gone on strike, was anxious about the public's response. And she was out there on the picket line and a car drove up slowly and she was ready to be, verbally attacked. The window rolls down and someone hands her a cup of coffee and donuts. And then she realized that this community was embracing the members. And it has been so clear. I spent days and days supporting those negotiations, and it was truly moving to see how much the community supports them. And the polling only backs that up. The one negative poll that Paul mentioned is by Democrats for Ed Reform, an anti-union group supported by dark money forces. It's ridiculous. What the polls have shown is what I have experienced and so many have seen, which is this joyous support for our educators by parents. Even though the schools were shut, they understood, they trusted that the educators were doing this only as a last resort in order to improve their beloved public schools.
Right. Thank you,
Carrie,
Max.
I just have to respond. I plead
just very quickly, because there's a great last question from a listener. So I want time for that, but yes.
Okay, I plead guilty to being a former CEO of a nonprofit 600-bed hospital that took care of thousands of patients a year, where the retention of our employees, the work environment was so good that it was among the best in the state. And that was because I was on the ground and I understand what it's like to have to deliver service to the public every day.
Thank you, Paul. Okay. So this last question, let's see. So there's a little bit of setup here. The person writes, the most recent and rigorous peer-reviewed study on the effects of teacher strikes and student outcomes was published by a Cornell-trained economist in the Journal of Labor Economics. Sounds interesting, actually. So that, they say, finds significant negative effects for students exposed to strikes. Anyway, I think the person is getting to the point of there was data collected, there was an analysis and sort of a scientific approach to looking at this. So how would both of you feel about supporting the collection of data with strike data, with student outcomes and things like that, and study that and then make decisions based on what that finds? Max, I want to start with you.
Well, I would love to read the study. What we know is that the improvements, the tangible improvements our members have direct impact on their education. Expanding prep time, collaboration time for teachers that members have won are crucial to improving schools. Everyone agrees on that. Lifting wages for paraprofessionals so we have enough of them and we don't lose them is crucial for our students with disabilities and really all students. So there are tangible benefits that we have seen over and over again in these strikes, and the parents and the community support them because they see the tangible benefits there.
Okay, thank you, Max. Paul, I want to ask you about that. What do you make of the idea of a scientific study about this? And would that, do you think, sway your opinion on this?
I think studies are studies, and they tend to get picked apart by whichever side doesn't like the result, truthfully. And sure, it's great to collect data. Who can be against it? I think some of this is just so straightforward, though, that when you see the impact on families of a public employees union strike, whether it's teachers or other employees, the case for that kind of prohibition in state law seems to me to be pretty straightforward. And it's existed in this state for literally decades. If I thought there was something substantially wrong with the status quo that overall leads to untoward results for the community as a whole, I'd say this is worth taking another look at, but I just don't see that. I'll keep an open mind. If studies are done, I'm happy to read them, but I just, there's a heavy burden there, I believe.
And Carrie, if I could just add, I would be interested to see the study, because one aspect that may not be looked at in whatever this article you mentioned is the lesson in civics that parents and students learn about educators standing up for themselves, exercising democracy, being activists, and what that long-term impact is. I can say that myself, as a student in the public schools in Amherst here in Massachusetts, when I saw the educators do work to rule, I've never forgotten that, seeing my social studies teacher decide, you know what, I'm sorry, we're not doing those after school activities. We have to stand up for a fair contract. I've never forgotten that. I suspect the students in Haverhill and Malden and Woburn and parents as well will not forget what they learned about their most beloved citizens, their educators standing up for themselves and for their schools.
Thank you, Max. Paul, before we wrap up, I want to give you a quick chance to respond to that.
Well, I think we do get civics lessons from all of these things, and Thoreau talked about the idea of disobeying laws in order to make a point, a moral point or whatever, and then being willing as part of that, part of the moral authority of disobeying a law is then taking the penalty when you do that, and that you choose to do that for what you consider to be a greater purpose. So if that's the way people want to proceed under the current system, they have every right to, and they have to understand that there are consequences.
Okay, we are approaching time for tonight's debate. I want to take a second just to say thanks to Paul and Max for joining me tonight and talking this through. I know I, as a reporter, learned a lot from this and have been sort of taking mental notes to follow up on different points for story ideas. So I very much appreciated this thoughtful discussion. And I also want to thank the Rappaport Center and the Rappaport Institute for coordinating this debate.
And I want to conclude the debate also by saying thank you to all three of you. I too have learned a great deal. I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, where when I was in high school, my public school teachers went out on strike. I learned a great civics lesson, I have to say, and I too live in Newton, where we had to work the rule when my kids were young. It's a very emotional issue where it seems very clear that everybody here wants to actually do what's best for our kids. So it's interesting, informative, provocative, little controversial here. So thank you all for sharing your insights, your thoughts, and for the work you all do.